Zocalo, as this plaza is called, has been the center of Mexican life since 1325, when first the Aztecs founded their capital here, and then in 1521, the Spanish came and created their capital of their colony here, and after 1821, it became the capital of independent Mexico. We're here at the Presidential Executive Office building, where every September 15th at 11 o'clock, the president steps out on this balcony, rings the bell, and calls on the people of Mexico to celebrate Mexican independence. Que viva Mexico.
Viva Mexico.
And this is an opportunity for us to look at Mexico in the last 25 years and look at remarkable changes without violence, but remarkable changes that constitute a revolution in civic life here in Mexico. This is the result of constitutional changes that have recognized Mexico's human diversity. It's also because of Mexico's position in North America through the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and the United States. And it's also a result of Mexico's global position, where Mexico's culture is recognized by the United Nations as one of the intangible heritages that everyone in the world shares. So there has been this remarkable change in Mexican life, and nothing makes that change more evident than the change in democratic politics and the democratization of Mexico today.
The democratization process starts in the late 1980s when President Salinas was in office, and there was a very controversial election in 1988 when he was elected to the presidency, and that controversy produced changes in the electoral process, which increased the potential for opposition parties to grow and provide competitive candidates, and produced one new major party, the Party of the Democratic Revolution, known as the PRD. And 6 years later, in the election of 1994, when President Zedillo took office, that election, interestingly enough, produced more participants at the ballot box than any other election Mexico has had since. In 2000, President Fox, representing the National Action Party, one of the three major parties in Mexico, defeated the candidate of the Institutional Revolutionary Party and became the first post-PRI president, which accentuated the democratic transition. And he was followed by President Calderón in 2006, who also was from the National Action Party and remained in office until the elections of 2012.
We invite you to join us in talking to former presidents of Mexico about these remarkable changes.
Most students who study politics are interested in what or who attracted prominent public figures to the political world. I know that your father, Luis Calderón Vega, whose work I read many decades ago, was politically active when you were a child, similar to many other future PAN leaders. Can you tell us who or what influenced you to become politically active, as well as why?
Of course, my father was one of the founders of the PAN in '39. Actually, he was a very old man when I was born. He was 51. The point is, when I was a child, of course, I was participating in campaign, really not understanding that, yes, knocking doors and shouting in a very old van in the roof with a very old sound system. And suddenly, of course, you can imagine that Mexico in the 60s, no? All the governors were from the PRI, all the senators, almost all the Congress, almost all the mayors, all the unions, of course. The press was under control, and when the students tried to claim for freedom and democracy, they were massacred in Tlatelolco. So that is the context in which I started to participate in politics with my father. I was a child. And when I was like a teenager or adolescent, and after a quite difficult campaign in which, in our opinion, the PAN won finally in Michoacán, in Morelia. Of course, there was a fraud, and the victory was not recognized. And I went to my father, and I told him, I'm done with this. No politics anymore. He told me, well, I understand you're angry, but you need to know that what we are doing here is not looking just for a victory or whatever. What we are doing here is our moral duty with the country. And if we don't do this, nobody else will do that. He was a very congruent man. I would say very religious. Yes, he was as well, but especially he was very congruent. He said, well, you need to know that doing politics in such a difficult context of in an authoritarian regime, but doing politics with principles, doing politics with honesty, is the way in which we understand the words of love your neighbor in this house. So you can do it or you cannot, either you decide. But in any case, I will be your father and I will love you as much as possible. So yes, it was a quite impressive lesson to me. He ended saying, well, and take note of this, talking about victories, probably you will never ever will see a governor coming from the PAN, let alone a president, you know? He passed away in '89. He reached to see the victory of Rufo, but actually he was unable to see a president of the party. He didn't care about that, certainly.
Would you please describe your early career in politics? Did any individuals mentor you, and how did they influence your professional attitudes and career?
Well, of course, the most important figure after my father at that time when I was very young was Gómez Morín. I have an incredible admiration for his career as Mexican, to say. He belonged to the quite young generation of people participating not in the armed part of the revolution, but building new institutions, proposing new ideas, participating with the revolutionary government. Gómez Morín was a 21st personal assistant of Secretary of Hacienda at that time, and then 22, 23 Mexican consul in New York, and he was trying to renegotiate the taxes that the oil companies owned to Mexico at that time, vis-a-vis the payment of the external debt of Mexico to the bankers, and trying to match taxes with payments. He got very disappointed from the government and from the Americans as well. He said, I'm very persuaded that every kind of evil is coming from here, from the United States, including malaria, no? But finally, but of course, disappointed for the Mexican government as well. He came back to Mexico. He participated with Vasconcelos, first in the university, trying to educate people with classics and lectures and so on in public squares and places. Then he is his personal secretary in the political campaign running for president. And there was a discussion between Vasconcelos and Gómez Morín. Vasconcelos, forecasting the fraud that was coming, proposed to Vasconcelos to organize a permanent movement that could be able to build democratic conditions for the country and motivating the citizens' participation, because the lack of such participation was on the roots of the problems we were living at that time, and even today, I would say. Vasconcelos accused Gómez Morín as a coward. The movement never is organized. The fraud came, and the oppositor to Vasconcelos won with 99% of the votes, 99%. There were some rebellions that were completely extincted in a very violent way by the government. Vasconcelos went to the exile, and Gómez Morín after that, and after being the youngest dean of the National University, the president of the National University, in a moment in which the government canceled the public funds to the university, as long the university was looking for autonomy, Gómez Morín was the president or the dean in the university, the National University, and afterwards he founded the National Action Party. So I admire a lot Gómez Morín. After that, I'm talking a lot of people inside the PAN, but anyway, Efraín González Morfín, candidate of the PAN in 1970, and probably the brightest person in the intellectual side of the party. Efraín proposed by first time ever, well, we'll say later like the third way, no? He was rejecting capitalism, he was rejecting socialism, he was rejecting that from the perspective that individualism as a philosophical basement for one and collectivism as a philosophical basement for another were completely false, considering the real social and individual and personal condition of human being. He built a new expression of politics, a third way in the 70s. So I really admire so much that poster. And afterwards, Carlos Castillo, who was my mentor, my teacher, and actually in a moment in the 80s, at the beginning, when I was getting into college, and my father, surprisingly to me, resigned to the PAN. Carlos Castillo, who at that time was very young, 33, 34, told me, you can either go out to the PAN and do nothing, or you can help me here to rebuild the PAN through providing seminars and lectures or speeches about principles, about ideas, about ethical values. So I decided to stay at the PAN. So in that order, my father, Gómez Morín, Efraín, and Carlos Castillo.
You have played a critical role in Mexico's transition to an electoral democracy, beginning in the 1980s with your active party role, and of course as only the second president of Mexico from a party other than PRI. Keeping in mind your role as part of that transition, what do you believe is the most significant contribution you have made as a public figure and as president to Mexico's democratic transition? Also, in that context, how would you view the controversial outcome of your presidential election in 2006?
Honestly, from the emotional part, from my heart, the age in which, or the stage in which I enjoyed the most, I would say my contribution to democracy was when we were fighting in the streets for democracy. Remember in the 80s, joining Luis Alvarez in his hunger strike in Chihuahua, and actually I was very young, and we participated, and I would say we because my current wife, Margarita, my only, one and only wife, was there. She was very young, as I was as well. We organized a protest in the door number 1 of Los Pinos. So suddenly we arrived hidden in some vehicles of congressmen. So we jumped out of the cars and deployed their banners and shouting, and it was a quite noisy protest. We were like a 12 or 15 kids. Well, kids, I was like a 20 years old, more or less. Then I participated with Manuel Cloutier Maquillo, and I went to hunger strike as well with him, demanding for electoral reform. And some days later, 1988, actually I won that year by first time ever my first seat, if I can say. I won quite weird thing in Mexico City. I won as a congressman in the Assembly of Representatives of Mexico City. But I went with the Cloutier and Hunger Strike in '88. And after I was congressman, and I participated as representative of the party and as also in all that process of negotiation with the government, including President Salinas and President Cedillo. And probably the most crucial part of my role is before being president, and the story is like this. I was elected as president of the PAN in '96 after being candidate for governor of Michoacan. I was 33 years old. And at that time, you can imagine that Mexico was completely in bankruptcy. So President Clinton made a loss in favor of Mexico. We need to express our gratitude to President Clinton and to the American society and government, honestly. But at that time, Mexico was a mess, in particular in economic terms. So I decided, as president of the PAN, and following the principles of the party, talking about the superior national interest over any other partial interest, I decided to support the government in order to find a solution to the economic crisis, but under the condition that the government must provide to Mexico a real electoral reform. So in that context, I started to participate with the presidents of other political parties, Muñoz Ledo from PRD, and President Cedillo, Santiago Oñate from PRI, Emilio Chaufet, Secretary of Interior, Gobernación, and we started to craft a new electoral reform, a real one. And finally, it was 3 o'clock in the morning one day, and in the office of the Secretary of Interior, Chaufet, and calling him to President Cedillo to the Red Fund, through the Red Fund. We finally got an agreement in which the electoral institution, completely independent, and by the first time not chair, but any public servant, and the new court related with electoral affairs, the new rules for financing the political parties, the limit to the over-representation of the PRI, la cláusula de gobernabilidad, or governability clause. All that stuff was agreed and signed finally that year. The day after was announced the electoral reform. And in that capacity, we negotiated as well the members of the new IFE, Electoral Institute, Federal Electoral Institute. The chairman of the president was Jose Woldenberg. Some of the members were Alonso Lujambio, Juan Molinar, quite a brilliant team of people, very serious. And I believe it was the best part of the Mexican transition. The day after, the PRI lost the absolute majority in the Chamber of Deputies, and 3 years later, the alternancy came to Mexico. So that part for me was quite important. Talking about the elections in 2006, I became candidate of the PAN really as an underdog, really behind in the opinion polls. Like I was like in the place number 12 or 13 at the very beginning. But we fought a good fight, to say, and surprisingly to anyone, with the exception of we won the primary, and I gave out some kind of bandwagon effect that put us on the track of being a real challenger to López Obrador, who was really ahead in the poll by several years. And he made an incredible mistake, among others. No? And the mistake was his team or himself considered that he was enough ahead in the poll, which looks like it was that way. He should not expose to me, because I have been always very critical to him, in particular those days. And he decided to not participate in the debate of the presidential candidates. So the outcome of that is, well, of course, I debated with Madrazo. Honestly, it was a funny debate, you can see that. The day after, I became the leader in the contest. And we fight, of course, we had a campaign attacking what I consider the most concerning points of López Obrador. His ideology, his angry, and the log of the campaña, López Obrador es un peligro para México, became an issue. So López Obrador is a dangerous to Mexico, became an issue. And that is the single accusation that these days they have against me. I coined, or my party coined that expression. Come on. It was a logo. It was true, honestly, according to what we believe in terms of the market, in terms of democracy, in terms of human rights. And we competed. And yes, the outcome was too tight. He won in Mexico City for a huge advantage. He was the mayor. But I won the rest of the country for even bigger advantage. And the difference was at least 250,000 votes. And I won. And there was no evidence about fraud. It was really sad because López Obrador never conceded, and I believe that provoked an incredible damage to the electoral and political institutions in Mexico, and that attitude and strategy reduced in an incredible way my capability to push structural change against really vested interests in Mexico, because some of those vested interests very well protected by the PRI. And at the same time, I attacked by PRD, especially López Obrador. So it was really difficult to craft a coalition that could be able to finally crack down over those vested interests. I did a lot of things. All the things I could do, I made. But I can say I won in a very transparent way. I won in a clean way. And I won, and my victory was contested with no single evidence of fraud. Even though if you compare the advertising of the PRD and López Obrador, he had even more advertising campaign on TV and radio than myself.
What do you believe are the most important consequences of PON governing Mexico for 12 years?
Well, we advanced a lot in a lot of things that are quite important for strengthening the institutions. We advanced in an incredible way in transparency. Probably we are having some kind of setbacks right now, and I have some concern about it. We advanced a lot in structural reform in the institutional framework, despite the facts that we needed to leave in terms of transparency, in terms of human rights, in terms of the judicial system reform, and so on. In the economic side, we provided an incredible and the largest period of stability, macroeconomic stability to the country, because we do the things well on that front. We were very responsible. And that provoked that Mexico became, during these 12 years, a middle-class country as a general concept. People were able to buy, since mobile phones and appliances to housing, for instance. Probably 25% of the total houses in Mexico in history were financed in these 12 years. In the social front, for instance, in my government, we reached almost universal health coverage, because President Fox advanced from covering like a 38 to 46 million Mexicans, and I advanced to cover 106 million people with a public health insurance. We can discuss about the efficiency of the delivery of the institutions to do that, but it's an incredible achievement. Let me one very brief tale about it. We discussed in the government if the popular insurance, the Seguro Popular, which is the instrument to increase the coverage, should be able or not to cover the cancer treatment for children, at least. People in finances say, at the end, they say, well, it's too expensive, it's not affordable. I decided finally to cover it, reassigning budget and getting more money. And the outcome is like this. For instance, before this change, 7 out of 10 kids with leukemia in Mexico died. And after the reform, 7 out of 10 children with leukemia survived. So for me as president, there is no words to describe what I felt at that time with the kids and their parents and so on. So universal health coverage, housing, the biggest infrastructure investment in history in Mexico. I passed from 3% of GDP to 5% of GDP. Only, for instance, in roads and highways, built or rebuilt in my period, there were like more than 14,000 miles, which is a distance, roughly the distance between North Pole and South Pole. In education, we reach universal coverage in elementary, and we are almost to reach universal coverage for secondary school. We reach parity between boys and girls in the school in every single level. We built infrastructure in order to provide opportunities for superior education. Only in my period, 140 new universities and 1,100 high schools, all of them tuition-free. And for instance, that is providing or allowing to graduate more than 100,000 new engineers a year in Mexico. And all these factors could help in order, talking of achievements, Mexico became a quite competitive and very powerful manufacturing country that is able to provide at least jobs, better quality jobs, than the traditional primary sector in the country.
We can identify many policies that are associated with your administration, but as you know, the most controversial policy you emphasized was that of proactively confronting the drug cartels. How did this specific policy preference come about? Why did you give such a strong emphasis to the kingpin strategy? And how would you personally assess the impact of that policy? With the benefit of hindsight, would you have altered this strategy in any way?
Well, let me clarify what this strategy was about, because I need to clarify that the strategy was not to fight drug cartels itself. No? The mainstream of the strategy is the rule of law. At that time and today, I believe that the most serious problem that Mexico and other developing nations are facing is the lack of rule of law. And the lack of rule of law provides corruption, and the lack of rule of law provides insecurity for the people. And all those conditions are the reasons, in my opinion, the reasons why nations, plenty of natural resources like Mexico, are not able to reach other stages of development, like the United States or the UK or European countries. What are the reasons? My own personal opinion is the lack of rule of law is stopping development. So the emphasis and the strategy was, we need to make Mexico a rule of law country. One side of that is to fulfill the law and to combat crime in any single form of crime. Now, what is the link with, or what is the link or the emphasis or the visual impact of this war on drugs to say? War on drugs, first, war on drugs has an incredible position in the mindset of analysts, journalists, academics. Why? Since President Nixon coined the expression war on drugs in 1971, for any single analysis, everything is about war on drugs. So when you try to distinguish rule of law, organized crime, drugs, it became like quite difficult to do, and probably was my problem. I was never able to explain that. I tried to do so. Second, what did I find when I took office? When I took office, I discovered that several small towns, villages, and even cities, and even some states were completely overtaken by organized crime. And the traditional attitude from the old political regime, let me say the old political culture, from the PRI, but also other people who really believe in that culture, is the best way to face the organized crime is just laissez-faire, laissez-passer. Don't fight them, don't disturb them, just take some bribe from them, try to get an arrangement, and everything is going to be okay. No, not everything is going to be okay. Actually, everything is going to be worse. And let me concede that in the past, to say past century, in that mechanism, the old political regime could work. I don't believe so, but let me concede that. Why? Because at that time, organized crime was exactly only cartels, drug cartels, and their business was only to export drugs to the US. So in that sense, reaching agreements with them didn't imply damage, they say, to the society. Why? Because the candidates or the governor just take the bribes, or the mayors or whoever. The guy just pass as fast as possible from Mazatlan to Tucson, and that's it. No? But now what happened? When Mexico started to be, especially after NAFTA, look at this. Mexico has a PPP from $2,000 per capita to $15,000 per capita. So Mexico became a quite powerful purchasing economy. And that phenomenon provokes that, yes, we started to buy any kind of goods and services, but also drugs. So Mexico became a consumption market as well. What are the implications for the performance or behavior of the crime? In the export business, the crucial issue are only or mainly logistical aspects and transportation. How can you put 1 ton of cocaine from Mazatlan to Tucson? It's a question of transportation and logistical aspects. But in the new business, on addition of the first one, retailing and selling the drugs in the street implies a quite different business. Is how can you get control of multiple points of sales in the streets? And the only way to do that is having territorial control. Like the control of legal markets have a Coca-Cola or PepsiCo or Corona beer, whatever. You need to have the control of multiple points of sales. The business of exporting coffee from Colombia to US or to the world is completely different from the business of a Starbucks coffee. Starbucks needs to be clear that there is the temperature of the coffee, there is the pumping cake and the apparatus or whatever, and the brand and the image of the store should be the same. You need to have control of multiple points of sales. You need to provide coffee on a daily basis. That's what happened in Mexico. So what is the big difference? I found it. The criminals started to take control of territories in Mexico. And that didn't happen before because the business was different. Taking control of the territory implies that they started bribing a policeman in the corner, but with the corruption, because the law enforcement institutions in Mexico were completely eroded by corruption, unfortunately. So for the criminals, it was so easy to take over the police corps, not only a policeman in the street, and the mayor, and in some cases, governors. So that's the situation I found it. The crime was overtaking the Mexican state. And what I decided to do is, we cannot allow that. We need to face the criminals, and we apply a triple strategy. First axis was face the criminals with the force of the state. You would say, in the US, face the criminals imply, okay, call the police, call the cops, no? Call the police to face the criminals. Well, but in our case, the county policemen or the municipal policemen, they were in the hands of the criminals. They were the criminals. Or the state policemen, they were the criminals. The only force we had were federal forces, including the army. So face the criminals with the force of the states, that remains, and there were federals. Second, more important than the first one, rebuild law enforcement agencies and institutions. And yes, I created the federal police. I established, by first time ever, as a general rule, the vetting process, either to get into the police corps or even to remain them, and the same for armed forces, Navy and Army. So toxicological exam, polygraph exam, psychological exam became a natural process. And that allowed us to clean up a lot, top to the bottom, those federal forces. And the same should pass in the Attorney General office, and the same, I believe, should pass in the judicial system, which is completely independent of the president. So when I tried to do that at the local level, most of the governments simply didn't care, simply didn't want to do so. And that explained the terrible situation we have in Mexico. Yes, it was so controversial, but I considered it was my duty to preserve the law, to fight the criminals, to rescue the state from the criminals. The violence was created with this, not because the action of the government, but because the expansionary strategy of the criminals that nobody wanted to see, or whoever could see that didn't, he or she, he didn't, or they didn't want to act, because I don't want to intervene or figure out what could be the reasons. Could be because, I don't know, corruption, or they were not brave enough, or they just trying to do the Mexican style of the fixed thing, which is take a little money for that, forget about them, ignore them, turn your face to the other side. I'm not like that.
Few Americans, including scholars, are aware of your personal passion for the issue of climate change and environmentalism. What do you believe your legacy might be for that internationally critical issue?
Of course, yes, you are right on that. It's my passion, definitely. Well, I'm a very passionate man, by the way, but that is one of them. Everything begins again with my father. I say that he was an old man when I was born. But the first time ever I started to listen about the environment and climate change was exactly from him. He was quoting quite important essays from that age. One of them was probably Our Common Future. Another quite important report from the Club of Rome that was made with the support of MIT, with the first computers at the time, in which they analyze the trends of the food, the trends of the population, the trends of the natural resources, and they published a quite important essay at the time, which was The Limits of Growth. So my father was in a political convention of the PAN, and he started to talk about that the process of acid rain, melting of the poles, melting of the snow on the top of the hills, and even in the Mexican volcanoes, Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, and changes in the environment, and droughts and floods, like an apocalyptic view. And some of the best friends of my father started to say, oh my God, Luis became too old suddenly, and he's becoming crazy, you know? But when I was a kid, I was like 18 years old or even less, not even like 15 years old, and it was fascinating to me. Again, as my father was a congressman, he was planting all the trees he could at that time, in the backyard in my house, but everywhere. Loving the planet, taking care of that. He was a real believer, and he talked about creation and the God's blessing in that way. So I started on that exactly. But now, before being president, actually I proposed a change in the principles of my own party, the PAN, Until 2000, the formal documents of the PAN never talk about nature and environment and climate change. I introduced the concept of sustainable human development, which is the name, by the way, of this foundation, in the documents of the party. And of course, being president, I was very impressed by the Stern report talking about the impacts of climate change and talking about the first argument in the economic sense, which is the cost of inaction is much bigger than the cost of action today. And getting all the way to the end, now I'm chairing the Global Commissions on the Economy and Climate for several reasons. First, because besides poverty, violence, or autocratism, climate change is one of the biggest challenges for human being in this century. And I'm quite sure that climate change will increase poverty even more, will make people suffer even more, and will create a lot of conflicts even more. Second, I believe that the main obstacle to take action is the general perception that taking action on climate implies huge economic cost. And the commission I'm chairing, and by the way, Nick Stern, Professor Lord Nicholas Stern is the co-chairman, we believe and we conclude in a quite serious report that I strongly recommend, the New Climate Economy Report, that dilemma in which we need to choose either being responsible with the environment or being responsible with the economy is completely false. That dilemma doesn't exist. It is possible to have economic growth, quite important, strong rates of growth, and at the same time, it is possible to tackle climate change. It is possible to alleviate poverty, and at the same time, it is possible to reduce the climate risk associated with the current carbon emissions trend. So it's a fight in which I feel completely committed. It's a thing in which I believe, and I think that I think it's very difficult to make things done, especially in the United States, which I will not say that skepticals or not skepticals. A lot of interest, opposing and denying things. No, this concept of stranded assets, a lot of natural resources, reserves of coal, or reserve of oil, or reserve of gas, that for the good of human being should never burn in the future and should remain in the soil. It's a horrible nightmare for a lot of interest there. Those strategies are present, saying, no, climate change is not proven, and climate change doesn't exist, and there's nothing we can do, blah, blah, blah. No, so I need to fight that.
Is this partly a result of Mexico's heritage as one of the most diverse, biologically diverse nations in the world, and also culturally and racially diverse? So does that diversity, is that encouraged you in this?
Completely. Well, it's part of the reason, definitely. We have been blessed with the country we have. I have been in my own state, Michoacán, which is one of the most beautiful states. We have lakes, we have woods, we have desert, we have coast, we have beautiful beaches, we have, it's an incredible place. And look at the weather in Mexico. It's fantastic. We have a summer every single day, or a spring every day. And I have been in Chiapas, for instance, in Montes Azules, an incredible, it's one of the last natural reserves, very well preserved, of jungle and raining forest. But at the same time, I have seen the people, indigenous communities. You remember, in Mexico, we have more than 10 million people belonging to the indigenous communities. And they are owners of those rainforests and woods, but at the same time are the poorest among the poorest. And we are not providing them economic opportunities to go forward with their families. And I'm the generation I belong to the generation who probably are seeing more clearly the terrible change we have made I have seen rivers in which I used to take a shower when I was a kid, and today are just sewerage. I remember all those beautiful woods in Michoacan, and now are just nothing. There is nothing above the hills. I have seen these landscapes, and I would see a lot of garbage everywhere, plastic bags. I'm very sad with that, very angry as well.
Do you accept the statement by some groups that sin maíz, no hay país?
It sounds good. No, I agree with them, but not in this sense, no? For instance, if to have crops of maize implies to destroy rainforests, of course not, no? If to have crops of corn or maize implies to provide incredible subsidies to a very rich people who are already rich in Sinaloa and other parts, that are using all those arguments to say, give me more money, give me more taxpayer money. For me, no, come on, I know them very well. The poor people in Mexico, the real poor farmers, real poor peasants, they even have not land. They are workers for others, and they need to crop either maize or other products that they have clearly more aggregate value or better price for Mexican products. No? And in the name of them, a lot of abuses have been made in Mexico. No? But yes, I believe maize is part of our own culture. It's an originary product of Mexico, like the cacao, like tomato, like it's a magnificent country.
You've received a great deal of praise for the dignity with which you handled the transition from your administration back to the pre. And could you comment on that a little bit, how that experience was for you?
Well, you need to remember that my own transition was terrible. No, I mean, I received office in such a difficult context. First, I had not the opportunity to see the former President Fox, even being of my same party, just once or two times between July and December, 5 months. And I would say 5 long months. And I was able to see the former president just twice. Second, I was not able to know my own house, Los Pinos, but the very same day, December the 1st. Actually, I went to took out of office with my briefcase in the Suburban, so it was terrible. And third, the very same office, could you imagine the second largest political force trying to avoid true violence, the oath of office of the President of Mexico, and nobody in the government or in the rest of political parties doing anything. So I need to take oath of office on my own with the support of my people. I memorized the oath of office and I did it. It was a great day, like a lot of scandal. But I conclude that it's not fair for anyone who represents, for good or for bad, the Mexican people, that such things happen. So I decided to go to live out of Los Pinos with my family like almost one and a half months before, in order to allow the new family to take possession of that. I decided to have continuous weekly meetings with the transition team of the new president, because it's in the best interest of the country that the new president and his team could know what the problems are and what are the alternatives. Even to be completely honest and say, we did some things quite right and we did others that just failed. And so we organized such smooth transition, 5 months, working weekly, trying to explain the issue, the problems of the country, the pain of the people, the most serious challenges, and I think it was the right way to do.
What do you regard as your legacy? What do you want your legacy to be here in Mexico?
My dream was that Mexico could be a real rule of law, And clearly, I could not make it in that part. But I consider that I did the most difficult part on that, trying to provide the rule of law in Mexico, trying to enforce the law, trying to improve the quality and strengthening the law enforcement agencies and institutions, which is, that's the most sensitive issue in my administration. Other way to describe is when I took office, there were two parallel movements in different directions. One is organized crime growing at incredible speed and taking control of everything. And the other were the law enforcement institutions, mainly police, corps, going down dramatically, falling down in a free fall. And at the end of my government, even recognizing that we could not fix all these issues, of course, the trend, for instance, in homicide rates went down since 2011, 2 years before my end. So we started to solve that. But my point is, different from the beginning, organized crime clearly was decreasing in power, and the force and the strength of the state was growing up. Saying that, I would say probably my legacy could be more on the side of infrastructure, the infrastructure we made. For a lot of people, they know that road, that highway, that bridge, that port was made under my administration. That could be. The legacy could be more in the side of improvement in the competitiveness of the manufacturing sector. When I took office, Mexico was the 9th largest exporter of vehicles in the world. When I left it, Mexico was the 4th largest, and it will be the 3rd largest exporter of vehicles next year. Other more could be in the social sector, more related with health system. And this tale I told you about the kids with leukemia is quite important to me. If I could be remembered for that, that could be enough. Maybe the people forget a lot of things, and there will not be a single issue. In part, I'm guilty on that because I'm very diffuse, trying to be specific in a legacy. But the best legacy I could imagine, and actually I didn't imagine at the end of my administration, is that I could walk in the streets of Mexico City, receiving a lot of support and warm reception from the people, saying to me that we are missing you and your wife. Congratulations for what you did. Probably I was not agree with some of your policies, but you try to do the right thing you believe. So such kind of things that could be my legacy, or beyond that, to have my conscience in calm and to be sure that I did what I consider it was my moral duty, exactly in the same way that my father taught me several decades ago. For me, it's my best legacy, I would say.